Okay, well, it's 1:45 by that clock, and we have a lot of material to cover, so come on in. Hi. I'm Charlie Betts. This is the DevOps in a Box, DevOps pipeline in your workstation session. So if that's not what you're looking for, I won't, go ahead and find what you are. In terms of ideal audience, so who am I, who are you? Ideal audience, from my perspective, you're interested in DevOps, you want to learn about it, you have some hands-on inclinations. If you're a super expert DevOps sysadmin ninja, you might find this really obvious and boring. On the other hand, if you're a super DevOps sysadmin ninja, I'd love for you to be here and tell me what I got wrong. And also, maybe we can have a higher order conversation about how do we teach DevOps. So that's kind of, setting out some of the, parameters, boundaries. I myself am not a DevOps sysadmin ninja. I am actually an architect and a researcher and an analyst and an author and a general troublemaker. This is the first hands-on actual technical presentation I've probably done in 15 years or so, but it represents 6 months of being very close to the metal and diving way down into DevOps and DevOps open source tooling. I had two choices as I was structuring this presentation, and I only made the call at the very end. I'm not going to talk up front about why I did this. I suspect that you all are probably fairly pragmatic. You just want me to get into the meat of what it is. And so I'm going to focus on that, and we'll take as many deep dives as we want. And if we have some time to talk about the motivations in the bigger picture, then we'll do that. If we don't, then talk to me over a beer, and I'll tell you my life story as to why I felt it important at my stage in my career to be downloading Vagrant and Linux and doing all this crazy stuff. So I'm not going to talk a lot about myself. I'm going solo, Digital Management Academy, that's my new hook. I've written books, I've written parts of COBIT, blah, blah, blah. So what is it? It's a project to create, this is the Git, it's up on GitHub. I am not offended if you are in your laptops and looking at this thing while we talk. Feel free to multitask. I will do my best to be entertaining or to jump up and down and shout if I think something's really important. If you want to start downloading stuff and installing it while we're here and you start firing it up and saying, Charlie, this doesn't work, that would be really cool as well. It's out there. I'm Charles T. Betts on GitHub. The project is called Calavera. I will talk about the reason for the naming later. It is a simplified, reproducible DevOps pipeline for educational purposes using Git, Vagrant, Chef, Java, JUnit, and Jenkins, Artifactory, and related technologies, and that is the only reading from the slide I will do today. So, boxes and lines. Yeah, I'm an architect. I deal in boxes and lines. But there's an architecture to DevOps, And I'm sorry this is so dim over here. We've been talking about it. Again, if some of you have laptops and you want to, pass the laptops around. But basically, I was kind of cringing today as I'm well acquainted with the cattle versus pets server thing, but I didn't realize that I had inadvertently given all my servers pet names. And that was kind of, I guess I should just be calling them build server 01 or something, and we'll talk about the naming. But basically, in a nutshell, you have a developer workstation. You have 6 Vagrant boxes. Now, how many of you are familiar with Vagrant? Okay, everybody, who is not familiar with Vagrant at all? Okay, are you familiar with virtualization, I hope? Because this is an intermediate session and we need to at least have that baseline. So Vagrant is like a really lightweight, fast way to trade bandwidth for configuration time in standing up virtual environments. So they've got a library of virtual images and a simple scripting language. And so basically you download Vagrant, you download VirtualBox, you can do Vagrant init in a directory, you do Vagrant up, and bang, you've got a small Ubuntu or Red Hat system, CentOS system. So the nice thing about Vagrant is it interoperates really nicely with Chef. And so the combination of Vagrant and Chef, you can basically start to stand up a whole cluster. And in fact, that is what I have on here. I have all 6 nodes running on a freaking MacBook Air. And I tell you, as somebody who started his technical career, 20 years ago, I'm a little older than a lot of you guys here. It's insane. It's sick. I mean, a 6-node Linux cluster on an Air. You know, it's unbelievable what you can do nowadays, and it makes architects very dangerous now, because used to be we always were kept, you know, keep the architects, you know, away from anything hands-on. They're just going to get into trouble. Well, now architects can get themselves into all kinds of trouble. So it's been a lot of fun. Anyways, we have a development environment. I used Java. I didn't use the mean stack, you know, because I had some experience with test-driven Java. Basically, you start to stand up the Vagrant recipes. It stands up this first node called Monos. I'll try to toggle back and forth here, but I do have to point to this screen for at least half the room. Monos stands up with, well, first you stand up a base image, and the base image loads Java, and then that just becomes the base image that everything gets. And then you get Java, JUnit, Ant, Tomcat, and then it puts a little mock development project on there called eho. And eho is just 2 Java class files and an XML file, and then it will run as Tomcat. And okay, it's just as if you configured your own little laptop with, you know, a Tomcat instance, like, you know, we used to do back in the day. I don't know who still does. How many Java developers in here? Okay, who's developers but not using Java? About half. So it's about half. This is not bad. Okay. So now the nifty thing is that it, you know, since it's installed Git, and then there's a central Git repository called Cerebro. If you build something locally, and once you're happy with how it's building locally, you commit it to Cerebro, and then Cerebro has a Git post commit hook. Who knows what a Git post commit hook is? Okay, who does not know what a Git post commit hook is? I should always ask. So the Git post commit hook is the integration mechanism by which Git then tells Jenkins to kick off, and Jenkins is running on a little node also called Ombros. All these nodes are Vagrant recipes. They stand up. They're configured with this stuff. It launches its own build environment. I decided even as a do the simplest possible thing, I wanted to have the pattern of always building separately from the core control server. As an architect, I just felt like that was better practice, even in a small demo. I didn't want to be building on the Ombros server. So it's actually built on a build environment called Brazos that looks a lot like Monos. And then if it passes the build, it then archives it to the package repo Artifactory. The package repo Artifactory then is accessed by Chef, which then moves the code down to the Kara environment. So I will now, and here is, you know, more on the just kind of, well, what it is. I mean, you have an extremely simple application that simply says this is a skeleton application. It's hello world, right? Okay. You have Artifactory, you have Jenkins, and let's see if I actually can, you know, demonstrate this thing in action. So I chose Ant rather than Maven, and I chose Chef rather than Puppet, and there were reasons for this, and I'd love for people to argue with me. I chose it because I'm teaching this at the University of St. Thomas, and I wanted stuff that, on balance, was slightly closer to the metal. I wanted less magic, not more magic. And so as I was researching this stuff, I saw people say, well, Chef is more imperative, and Puppet's more declarative, and Maven can get really magic underneath the covers, and I felt, but Ant is just more, you know, strictly procedural. So that's why I chose those for pedagogical purposes. But I did take the Maven directory naming convention. So if I do this, here's my main servlet Java file. I'm going to now change the hello world message to v2 and exit out. I'm going to sudo ant. I have no idea if it's best practice on your own workstation to sudo ant. And I'm, you know, you can see here there's things that's like, okay, you know, Ant doesn't really think I should be using the command attribute, but there is this other thing it wants me to use, and I went and tried to use it, and it was just more of a headache than it was worth. So there's all kinds of stuff in here that in production, in the real world, any number of you are probably going, oh, geez, you know, he did it that way, you know, and I get it, you know. So, but now we hopefully have a build here, and if I go to the actual V2, okay, woohoo, V2, okay, so hello world works. And then if I go git commit, trying v2 change, it then committed correctly, and now it looked like git push origin master. This funny error-looking thing. Oh, quick, quick, quick. Can we see it? Can we see it? Can we see it? May have already. It goes really fast. Yeah, it went. So we didn't get over to Jenkins quickly enough. But trust me, build 3 succeeded. We have blue. Yay, it built. OK, now it's still not there in production yet. And I did this deliberately. Now, obviously, Jenkins is fully capable. I could have had Jenkins actually push the stuff to prod, but then you see I saw all kinds of debates about this because we still do have this desire to, or this debate or some discomfort around, well, what do we really mean by continuous deployment? I mean, okay, we have continuous delivery. I delivered that into Artifactory. It's there, trust me, right? Because if the Jenkins build would have been red if it hadn't pushed the new version into Artifactory. But I'm not going to push the trigger on release, and actually I said to myself, no, that's going to be Chef. We're going to have it a different tool set that in this little hypothetical lab is owned by the ops team or I don't care if you call it DevOps team or whatever. It's a different tool. It's a different process. That's on purpose. Now, how many of you might use Jenkins just to go ahead and push to prod? Okay, so you think that's fine in your organization, that works just great. How many of you would not use Jenkins for the reasons that okay. Okay, yeah, so we got people on both sides of the debate. So at least I'm in the middle of the debate, so that's a good thing. I haven't done something that everybody thinks is crazy. Well, maybe you all think I'm crazy, I don't know. Anyways, so if we go Vagrant provision Kara, hopefully this works. Sometimes I get an error that it doesn't like it's done something with the file mapping. And so now what this is this is Vagrant actually going in and evaluating Kara and reapply and telling Chef, okay, Kara looks good, now Chef, go do your thing. And Chef is going in and doing its thing, and it's evaluating Kara against the declarative Chef recipe. It's saying, aha, I think there's a new file here. Yep, Calavera main.jar. Got to do something about that because it's not matching according to the policy. And now I got to restart Tomcat. And assuming I'm not jumping the gun here, V2, woohoo. Okay, you can all applaud. Right, so pretty basic, right? I mean, but it's all there. Go ahead, yes?
There's nothing preventing you from using Jenkins to call your Chef.
That's true. Yeah, no. And again, it's a procedural issue. In this case, and maybe I'm just old school, but that discomfort around saying that I'm just going to push it all the way through. No, it's a separate step. We're going to, and you could have the, and certainly, you could change it and you could parameterize it. Certainly that would be no disadvantage to doing that. I have not got an actual QA environment. In fact, it was discussed earlier today that, well, why would we have QA environments? I think we still do need QA environments, and I think that there is a need for exploratory human testing. I think the beauty of automated testing is to get past all the stuff that monkeys could do, but then you have your human testers do more devious and creative things that you can't automate. So I still think that there is a place for QA environments. But if there was to be a QA environment, you would simply just reproduce the Kara production environment. And then that would also be a place where you could run, say, load scripts. And that's the intent of evolving this, is to evolve it in that direction with load testing. In fact, there's a wide variety of ways that this project and this product could evolve. And that does get into some of the motivations for it. I'll talk a little bit, just about some of the, we've taken kind of the whirlwind tour through it. Talk a little bit about some of the requirements. I think it does need 8 gigabytes of RAM. It needs Vagrant, VirtualBox, Chef DK. I went back and forth on whether I wanted to use a kitchen.yml recipe as the overall driver that would then call Vagrant, which Chef DK can do, versus using the Vagrant file as the overall driver. I decided that I was less likely to change out Vagrant and more likely to want to change out Chef. So after using kitchen.yml for a long time, I backed away from that, went back just to a Vagrant file that invokes the Chef, and Chef has been well behaved that way. Originally, I wrote it as all shell scripts, but the thing is that automating Jenkins got a little headachy just with shell scripts. I found different approaches. You're smiling. But the Jenkins API support in the Chef cookbook, and that's really the only place I have found solid Jenkins API support, and even there it's not quite complete. I had to do some hacking of, dumping out various XML files and then loading them under the covers with Jenkins. Nick, you look like you've been down this road a bit. Any thoughts on how else to actually automate Jenkins itself? It's kind of a bootstrapping problem. How do you automate the automated pipeline? It's been an interesting recursive question.
Quite a bit of Jenkins automation, and
Yeah.
basically you can go to any job or whatever and do those Slack API.
Yep.
And you can get JSON or XML or whatever you like.
Yep.
You can parse it. If your aux skills are fine, you can
Yep.
parse out JSON and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also the CLI tool
Right.
you can download.
That's where I got this from. So I used the CLI tool to dump out the job definitions and the JFrog Artifactory configuration, and then I just saved those off as files. But then I felt, to some extent, it almost felt like I was cheating a little bit because, okay, here's this big magic bunch of XML that you just stick in under the covers and it works. But where's the teaching? Where's the learning? Is one of the challenges. But good points. Yeah, absolutely. You can do all that. I'd love to see it all look like. So here's an example of the actual Jenkins API being exercised in the Chef recipe. But there are some things you couldn't, that I just couldn't get to. You can't use the Jenkins API in the Chef recipe to configure Artifactory, at least not as of like 3 weeks ago, to the best of my knowledge. So just a variety of approaches that were required. I went round and round on things like, SSH permissions, and you got to have those set up because this was again as a little exercise in the box. There were certain lines I didn't want to cross. I didn't want to cross using clear text credentials. So it's all set up with RSA SSH. Although I did just use one private key pair across all 6 nodes in the cluster. I figured as long as it was working with public-private key, it would be easy enough for somebody to take it as a baseline and then change it and evolve it. Thoughts, comments, questions as to why I chose certain approaches? Too fast, too slow, too simple, too hard? I mean, this was in part. I'll talk about my motive. It looks like we will have time to talk about some of the motivations. So, this was fun. So I wanted to use the theme of walking skeleton because that was the whole idea. This was going to be a walking skeleton of a DevOps in a box. If you Google walking skeleton, you get 2 major families of imagery. You get a lot of skulls and roses, and I could have done all the naming like Jerry and Pigpen and Terrapin and Ripple and Uncle John's Band or whatever. But the other major theme of walking skeletons you get is Dia de los Muertos. And I've been doing a lot of genealogical research and traced my lineage back into Europe several centuries. So I thought, well, why not? I'll take it a Day of the Dead. I'll take a spin. So I started naming everything after body parts and bones and stuff like that. So you have, and some of this is repeating myself. Forgive me if I'm kind of just going into a little more depth on some of these things. This is the first time I've given this presentation, so I always wind up with a little redundancy sometimes. But then in Manos is, again, it's the developer workstation based on those technologies. Cerebro, central Git repository for the products. Now, I have the product is called eho, and it is not a virtual machine. It is actually just a directory. And the idea of the pipeline is that it could support multiple products, and that is the way I intend to scale it. And then you get into the interesting question of, well, I might still stand up a separate development machine if I'm going to use mean stack. And so how do, that would be the next major development pipeline I might do, would be the mean stack. And then how does that, what changes in the architecture does that force? Ombros and Brazos, shoulders and arms is Jenkins, and then the Brazos slave. Again, if I'm doing mean stack, I'll have to build something akin to Brazos, but then using MongoDB and AngularJS and the rest. Espina, now the package repo. So I did this in part as a learning. I felt like I was getting too far away from the coalface. I was getting too far away from real, actual practice with some of the enterprisey stuff, enterprisey places I'd been. The role of the package repository was a bit new to me because I came from the bad old days when you just tended to stick all the compiled binaries in with the source files in PVCS, horrible old source code. And we didn't, nowadays it's like, oh God, no, you don't put your binaries in with your source. Am I right? I mean, that's just not done anymore. But believe it or not, that's relatively recent from the perspective of somebody, who kind of dropped out of active development for a number of years. And then the role of these package repositories in serving as proxies for software that you might download from the outside world is very architecturally interesting, and actually then found itself into some of the standards work I'm doing with the IT for IT standard. And it generated some very interesting discussions on the role of things like Sonatype Nexus and Artifactory, and what's the Apache thing, Archiva. So more on that later. And then finally, Kara is the simulated production environment. So it's all there. We could take deeper dives. If anybody has any specific implementation questions, the code is all there. You can just review it. I've built it dozens and dozens of times now. The Windows build was not working as recently as last week, but I've now built it on Windows a number of times. The Mac OS and Ubuntu builds have been done over and over again. It's still brittle. It's got hard-coded URLs to the packages in them. I mean, this is a training and teaching tool. It's not production ready. It's not, I'm well aware it's not parameterized. You'll see all kinds of stuff in there. It's like, why isn't there error handling on that? Well, I was trying to get the whole thing up and running. So it's a walking skeleton. There's a lot of cushioning, a lot of protections it doesn't have yet. Looking for help. As a GitHub project, this is one of maybe the more accessible GitHub projects. You don't have to be super knowledgeable and some in-depth, multi-threaded concurrent class of programming. So if you're a person who, for your own career reasons, you want to start showing that you've got some GitHub track records, I'm pretty approachable, pretty collaborative, I like to think. Would love to have some people helping me out on this. And certainly if you're in the business of trying to teach people how to do DevOps, then hopefully this is a reasonable and a useful tool. So that's the first half of the chat. I'm going to talk a little bit, at risk of maybe being a little self-indulgent, about some of the whys and wherefores, but I think it'll get to an interesting place. So if you'll just bear with me, I'll take a drink here. By the way, anybody know Mr. Micko, Dave Micko out at Bluestem? Yeah. Yeah, Dave was the one who put me onto Haiku. He said it's an awesome tool. So this deck is all done in Haiku. So, yeah, that's me. This is a famous line from The Matrix. I am the architect. What did he say? I've been waiting for you. And of course, what do we all say about architects? Ivory tower, theory, boxes and lines. Comes in, tries to tell us what to do. Well, the thing is we're all adaptive dynamic systems, right? And an architect starts hearing that, long enough, you start to feel, oh, geez, what the hell good am I, anyways? It was clear, and I'm not apologizing, too much, but the thing is I started to look at DevOps, I started to look at Agile, I started to realize I don't feel authentic. You know, I feel like I'm reading about this stuff. I have some idea because I had been hands-on technical. You know, it's not that I didn't know what a computer was or that I'd never written a line of code. I had a production system that ran at Target for 10 years, you know, but it was, you know, built in a very different age with different tools and techniques. And I started to feel like the whole DevOps and Agile movement, that there was stuff coming out of that that was having real impacts on my understanding of enterprise IT, because my specialty is understanding enterprise IT as a system. And we can talk about, you know, it's large, it's bureaucratic, it's frustrating, you know, it's behind the times, it's slow, maladaptive. I mean, go down the road. But at the end of the day, the fundamental reality is a company like Wells Fargo spends $5 billion a year on IT. That's real money even by congressional standards, you know. And that is run, you know, as a value chain and as a business activity of some kind. And so it's a very interesting set of questions about how can we scale this stuff. So in my consulting, in my authoring, in my research, I'm talking to people that are saying we got to figure out how to scale Agile. I'm like, oh, I'd love to help with that, but I don't think I can help unless I get down at the coalface and do something. And short of actually trying to join a small product firm, you know, and, you know, live the life, this was the next best thing in terms of at least starting to understand some of the principles of what was going on. And as I said, I'm teaching, and you know, I'm teaching IT infrastructure class at St. Thomas. And so, what am I going to teach? How are you going to teach kids? This stuff's complicated, and they're not learning it in the computer science departments. I know this for a fact. I mean, you get the occasional instructors that come in and want to bring some of this stuff in, but mostly this stuff's not curricular. And you know, this stuff took me half a year to figure out. You know, coming from scratch, how do you train, you know, a young entry-level grad student or an undergraduate in this stuff? I mean, we need some techniques, we need some tools, and we need hands-on because people are tired of lectures, you know?
And operations is even farther off.
Yeah, absolutely. Operations, and yet where's the value if it's not operating at the end of the day? You know, I mean, that's what are the academic, you know, the professors say, well, operations is left as an exercise for the end user. Yeah. I'm sorry, you know. And then you get others saying, well, what about ITIL? I mean, don't get me started on ITIL. Not a fan. And then I love the image of the surveyor, because at the end of the day, I'm not going to stop drawing boxes and lines, you know, because boxes and lines are powerful communication tools. They draw on the visual cortex. The visual cortex takes up about 25% of our brain power, whereas the serial, like the code we all know and love, that's processed by the auditory cortex, and that does not get anywhere near as much love from the overall capacity of the brain. So we're always going to have people drawing pictures as sense-making exercises. You'll never get rid of architects, I'm sorry, you know, because you're always going to be drawing pictures. The question is how? And the question is, you know, I think the surveyor image is perfect because you want to be responsible in your creation of the abstractions. So the surveyor is going to draw a map, which is a visual representation of a complex three-dimensional reality, but the surveyor is using some precise tools, and that's part of the inspiration for doing the work. And then finally, simply just having a reference model. But why would I want a reference model? What's the big idea? Kind of what's the end game here? So as I talk, you know, move into the last section of the presentation here. Calavera, I intend it as a microcosm. I'm going to keep scaling it in and of itself. I've already got, you know, the beginnings of Nagios plugged in, and with some of the nice help from Nagios. Brian's here. Nagios has been, you know, very, very kind to me. And then other things like collaboration tools and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, my goal is to start to draw out some of these abstractions. Certainly, creating this object model was very interesting and would not have been possible without some of the detailed examinations that I undertook in Calavera. The critical importance of a commit, and how commits relate to builds and releases and deploys. And this is inspired in some sense by who's 12factor.net? Anybody 12-factor architecture? Yeah, good stuff. 12 factors, very good. So this is inspired in part by what I learned with the simulation as well as a 12 factor. You start to build the object model, you start to then be able to get some line of sight to more ambitious avenues and adventures, avenues of inquiry, is what I meant to say. So if Calavera is at the bottom, is at this level of a person individually in their computer, well, one of the next steps is okay, for my class, can I put a collaboration architecture on it? You know, do I put LeanKit on top of it? Do I put HipChat? Do I put, how do we start to use that actual realistic pipeline in terms of setting up some labs that draw out the collaborative aspects? And then at some point you have to deal with the process, and the process question is not going to go away. I'm not, I have a lot of things I could say about frameworks like ITIL and TOGAF and COBIT, and I know a lot of us love to laugh at these things, but at a certain point of scale, and I think that the Spotify, tribes and whole thing. Who's read that article that was referenced about tribes and guilds? Some of this stuff is just emergent. You get to a certain level, and Dunbar's number drives it, and then there's another guy named Don Reinertsen who talks about things like cadence and sync points. Dean Leffingwell's talking about scaled agile framework and its need for release trains. I know some of these things are controversial, but in order to scale this stuff, these problems don't go away. So what I've been saying to my colleagues in the standards community and the architecture community is, look, we've got to start running some simulations. We have to start actually basing this, because right now, what it is in IT management and IT governance is you get somebody sticking a box on a whiteboard and putting a word like capability on it, and then they'll take another box and they'll put a word like service on it, and then you have a religious discussion for 3 years. I'm just very, 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 very tired of this. And, service versus applications, microservices versus SOA. And so if we can start to understand the emergence of these dynamics and the emergence of the complexities through being grounded in a simulation, I think this would be a good thing. And here's some of the other abstractions I've dealt with. This is one of mine that I've created. I'm not going to go into any kind of depth. This is the IT for IT reference architecture. Now notice one of the things that I've been looking at here is saying, okay, where do queues emerge? Okay, right now at this point we're at a wholly different level of scale. Calavera is living somewhere down here, and now we're looking at all of this stuff that's used to run the large-scale IT departments, and I'm looking at this and I'm listening to people like Donnie, who was at Donnie's thing this morning. Ticketing is evil. Well, how do you make sense of, a statement, like ticketing is a bad smell, ticketing is evil, this is, ticketing, how do you make sense out of that? When I just was talking to the lead IT architect at one of the major auto manufacturers, said we just ran 4 huge transformation programs, spent millions of dollars putting in things like ticketing systems. And it's not that they aren't going to, start looking at where the world's going, but I mean, how do you get people synchronized across IT spends in the billions of dollars without things like ticketing systems? And I don't think it's a simple yes, no, either or answer. I think you have to look at this phenomena of emergence and say, well, where is it appropriate, and where do where is it best that people are just, kind of face-to-face collaborating, and where is it then necessary that we have some kind of a formalized synchronization point that is actually in a queue. The other failure, though, of the current process architectures is that there's too bloody many queues. Who's read Don Reinertsen? Okay, most important book, Principles of Product Development Flow. I'll just bring it up on Google so you can see the cover. This is the most important book out there right now. And this is the book that the Poppendieks were reading Reinertsen. They're big fans of him. I mean, I've written a book. Buy Reinertsen's book before you buy mine. I mean, put it that way. It's that important. Then this guy, he's not even an IT guy. He's He's a product development specialist, but he basically lays out the math for Agile. He lays out the math for why Agile works and why Agile is being proven as superior to waterfall development. He talks about the failures we've had in product development. And one of the number one things Reinertsen says is you have to get a hold of queuing. The queues kill you because the queues are work in process. And the thing with IT is not only are we bad about tracking the work in process, we are bad about even understanding the instruments and the vehicles by which we are tracking the work in process. We don't even have the queue of our queues. You know, it's one thing to have one workflow. Haiku crashes sometimes, by the way, though. It just locks up and then it doesn't want to move. No, it doesn't damage the presentation, but it's so. So in the course of doing this work, sorry, it also buffers really well. So as you start to say, okay, if I can simulate a pipeline, if I can simulate one DevOps pipeline, I can simulate 5. If I can simulate 5 products moving through a common pipeline, I can simulate 15 products moving through 2 pipelines. I can start to simulate the different queues by which work is accepted in large, non-trivial environments. And then hopefully I can start to understand the systems dynamics and the actual complexity that emerges as human beings attempt to collaborate on these systems in an organized way. That is the hope. It's all models. It's all and it will need a series of them. So this is kind of the final slide I'll throw out for you. Is we have your basic Calavera. I need to get Calavera ported over to Docker for sure. That's high priority because it'll be much more scalable. I mean, I can only run 6 or 7 VMs on this Mac Air. I'll be able to run 100, or at least dozens of containers. And then also moving it up into some of the collaboration tools. Now, at some point, it's not just a matter of having a small simulated system because I right away you say, well, I need a dozen people to start operating that thing and participating in the simulation, which may be where I take some of the training that I'm thinking about doing. But at some point, you need the actual just completely abstract, true simulation. Is anybody familiar with Troy Magenis, his work? He's been doing work on using Monte Carlo with Kanban. It's a module that they tried to put in LeanKit. It was a little too advanced. But basically, it's a way of doing estimation. I know there's the whole no estimates thing, but it's more of a probabilistic, let's look at the distributions that we're likely to have, rather than just saying, oh, I can do it in 3 weeks, and then having somebody crack the whip and beat you up because you didn't get it done in 3 weeks. It's like, no, let's be a little more scientific. And then finally, anybody see Adrian Cockcroft's at the ThoughtWorks? He talked about this Go simulation. That ultimately is where I want to take some of this. At that point, you're not doing Calavera. You're doing something very different. You're dealing with little objects, each of which is an abstraction of a node or some kind of abstraction of even just a product with an API. But it's all part of the same continuum that I think we need to start building out and understanding in order to really start to get our heads around. How can we scale this stuff? How can we scale it up? How can we have sensible, evidence-based discussions rather than religious wars about this or that? So that's part of the intention and motivation for doing this. It's multifaceted, multivariate. Number of different things that are coming to play here, from the practical issues of setting up labs for my students all the way to this crazy stuff, which I fully admit may take the rest of my career, But I like to do crazy things. People laughed when I said I was going to write a book, and I wrote a book. It's in the 2nd edition, so, it's hey, what else is life for? Anyways, love to get some feedback. Love to have any questions, thoughts, criticisms. Why did I do it that way? Anything I said that wasn't clear? Yes.
Just curious, what size are the VMs that you're creating?
Typically, you download the packet, the Vagrant file that you'll download. Sorry, you don't download the Vagrant file. You wind up downloading a VirtualBox VMDK file. Is that it? Typically, I think the Ubuntu one would be about 400 megabytes. You keep me honest here, if anybody. Yeah. And does it take about that much then in RAM? It seemed to be tracking, the RAM consumption seemed to be tracking the VMDK. I'm not an operating system engineer by any stretch. Like I said, I get 6 or 7 running on an 8 gig Mac Air, and then it starts to die. Yeah. And Docker containers are a lot lighter weight, but they're a slightly different animal. It's not going to be trivial to port this all over to Docker. Sure.
It's a great idea that you're doing a simulation and you get students and people learning it. Because frankly, I've learned all this stuff on my own, and I look around and everyone else doing stuff is like rushing to learn on their own, not being taught. Are there other people aside yourself who are incorporating this into like infrastructure courses or something?
Not that I know of. I went and looked, and I didn't find anything on GitHub or anything. Yeah. Okay, cool, thanks. Okay, there are. I'd love if you could send those, because I mean, I did the usual 10 minutes worth of Googling. Nothing's popping up. Okay, it must not be happening.
Then you hire people and they have no clue what a lot of stuff is. I mean, they're knowledgeable, but they don't understand the big picture.
Right.
And how all these different people, even what the pieces are.
Right.
And how they integrate together and sort of what the issues are.
Yeah, and that's the intent. I mean, that's we at St. Thomas, we definitely are targeting. We know we're training people for industry, and you need to know this stuff. It's not, and you can teach it in terms of the principles and the motivations. It's not just trade school. I mean, that's where you get into the academic discussion. Oh, that's just something we should leave for the trade schools. Well, no. I think that there's actual principles here that can be taught with some rigor. And even in universities, you still do labs. That's not just, so I don't want to get into that discussion. But yeah, no, thank you. That's good feedback. Oh, yeah.
So I've been in the process of building a pipeline for my company inspired by the whole 12-factor methodology thing. And I've never been able quite to wrap my head around so if you have a piece of software that has peripheral side pieces of software it talks to, like a Mongo or an API or whatever, things that connect to it. Where does my description of those systems live, if not in because if I have, a Vagrant file that describes, here's how you set up the database, here's how you set up X, Y, Z, that's going to be duplicated with my description in Chef or Vagrant or in Ansible or whatever of the production environment. And so how do I make sure I'm not duplicating effort there and have like 2 separate lines of development that describe my database?
Okay, I'm not sure I completely understand because there's 2 different ways that this plays out. One is a development versus operations boundary, and the other is a system stub proxy boundary. And I heard both themes in your comment.
Well, set me straight then.
So at first I thought my answer was going to be service virtualization, which is the idea that if you it's basically mocking on steroids, and I'm not sure where service virtualization is going to go. It seems like a very good idea. I've talked to the like the CA Lisa and the people who do that. Anybody here working with service virtualization? Okay, I mean it fulfills a certain need if you have a system that has many dependencies. How do you effectively test those dependencies if the other systems that you're integrating with in real time don't have performance test ready infrastructure? It's a significant problem. I mean, if you've got a system that needs to scale, well, perfect example is when you got external services. So you got a system that you have a system that you know needs to scale to X thousand calls a minute against, you know, PayPal or Akamai or something like, or, you know, Sosta, something like some cloud-based API, and you just want to test some stuff, and then they're going to start charging it, cha-ching, 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 and the call is stupid and trivial, and it doesn't exercise any of their real behavior. So you build a little mock, and you just say, well, you know, in general, we know that this API call is going to consume about this much time, right? But, you know, there's some scary things that happen with that. Go ahead.
It looked like in Monos you started from the developer's perspective. Have
Yes.
you thought about going one step further or earlier in getting requirements management?
Absolutely.
So then you can do traceability.
Yes.
And then in this environment,
Yes.
tech here,
Yes.
we want to be able to have everything push button, report, FDA submit.
Yep.
Boom.
Yep. No, extending it in that direction with RSpec or Cucumber, definitely part of the plan. Part of the, it just, you know, I had to start with a kernel somewhere, and I figured that was a good kernel to start with. Also had thought about better automated testing. I did not do server spec, and I thought long and hard about that, but that just seemed like that was going to add a little too much overhead.
So, how many of your students have been contributing?
They've just been consuming. I have one who is actually capable of contributing, and he'll probably make a contribution, and as a result, get out of the final. That's the deal. If I accept one of your pull requests into Calavera, you don't have to take the final. You probably don't need it, but. All right. Yeah. Yeah. Further. Yeah. So if you like it, you've got a GitHub log, and please at least give me a star. You know, if you think it's valuable, helpful to the community, and I'd love to. You know, like I said, there's all kinds of low-hanging fruit in there. If you even know a little bit of Chef or shell scripting, Jenkins config, I'm sure that many of you, if not most of you, could come in and just, you know, knock some little fix out, wrap something that should obviously be in an error handling thing. I'd really appreciate it. You know, it's all going out. It is being. There are a couple people who have forked it and are looking at it. There's a woman over in Israel, I think, who's to the question of is anybody doing this. There is a woman in Israel who's now been very active in helping me shake out some of the bugs. So it's starting to get a little bit of traction.
Do you have a wish list for things that you want to be worked on? Like, give us a teaser of your top one or two.
Well, the Nagios, you know, and I just picked Nagios. It was funny. I googled open source monitoring. I had all the, you know, got into all this stuff, and I'm well aware of some of the debates. Then I only found out after the fact that they're here. I was like, okay, I'll go. And I think there's a couple. Definitely monitoring, I think is probably the major next one, and then mean stack, monitoring and mean stack. So like a Monos equivalent, you know, Monos 2 or something else that would, and then, you know, how does that impact, you know, the rest of the pipeline? So a radically different, you know, tool set, but still using the core of Git, Jenkins, and Artifactory, and does that affect the architecture? That's the major next architectural question I have. Yeah.
Part of this, are you looking at also like something like elk stack or Elasticsearch log stack?
So I hadn't heard of elk stacks. There's a lot of things I haven't heard of, but definitely as you scale, as you view that, looking at that scale up, in order to have a simulation that's meaningful for things like log analytics, you start to need to simulate not just a few machines, you start to need to simulate like hundreds. That is definitely part of the program. I don't know how to solve it yet. And that's what I think I have two projects. This is the Calavera project, the broader project to simulate everything I call Insanity. INSANIT. Yeah. It's an insane idea of simulating an entire like major U.S. bank IT organization in code. Yeah, I'll be lucky to get it done by the time I retire. But hey, you got to have something to, strive for. Right, you got to have something to do. Yeah.
So you mentioned you have your stack building on a Windows view
Mm-hmm.
into building a Windows server stack inside.
As part of the subject, that would be great. I hadn't thought too much about it, partly because some of the licensing issues, but ultimately, yeah, that would be important. And St. Thomas actually has a strong working relationship with Microsoft, so I imagine sooner or later that question may be asked by my dean.
I would take your class when you're forced to do it.
Okay. We may do some lighter weight seminars on this at St. Thomas too. Like, just do this for a couple days and just walk through the whole thing with the workstations provided. Would there be would any of you have interest in that, or have interest in walking through the whole thing? Okay, cool.
My other question, have you thought of moving this to the cloud?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, that's another major enhancement. It has to be spun up. I did it because I did not have an Amazon credit card, and I had the local capacity, and it was more under my control. I could work on it on an airplane. But it's got to, totally, it has to move to the cloud.
Moving away from servers,
Yep,
right?
yep,
They
yep.
have no names for a reason. They're
Yeah.
services, and
Yes.
we're not monitoring servers anymore, we're monitoring services.
Absolutely.
Scaling and all that stuff in there.
Yep,
And really the only effective way of possible
yeah.
of doing it is putting it in.
I totally agree. I mean, I'm glad I started it as something that would run very cohesively on one node, but it absolutely needs to scale in that direction. So there's a whole bunch of directions it needs to go in. What time how are we doing what time are we supposed to be done? Oh, are we over? Okay, I'm sorry. Thanks. Really appreciate it. Talk to me.